Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Transition Accelerator webinar series. Really happy to have some esteemed guests, frankly, from around the world joining us today for our topic, like, how does a natural gas ban fit into Canada's net zero future? We're going to get to that quickly, but I'm going to take care of some housekeeping things first. First of all, I'm just going to say that we are an organization that has staff from coast to coast. And because of that, we really understand that we are living and working on land that was occupied by Indigenous First Nations for millennia. And we really respect that and consider those communities colleagues in our quest to get to a competitive net zero future Canada. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some upcoming events and webinars that we have, and then we'll introduce our guests and get into the guts of this event here today. First of all, I'm going to talk about a forum that we've got in 2024, May 14th and 15th in Toronto. We're really excited about this. We actually think it's going to redefine what conferences are. And I know that sounds a little bit cheeky, but in some of the polling that we've done, we really understand that people are a little bit tired of showing up to conferences and listening to people talk on stage. So we've taken a completely different approach. We've ripped a conference down to its bare bones and we're building it back up. What this is essentially is a highly interactive session where 250 people, that's capped attendance, interact in real time with experts on each of the key sectors in Canada. Think transportation, think buildings, think electricity, that we have to get right in our transition in order to make sure this country is going to be competitive and net zero in the future. So what these experts are going to do, again, highly interactive, is ask the key questions that people have around what's going to work and what's not going to work and why. So we honestly think that as people leave this forum with these individual sessions and the interactive plenaries, that they're going to leave with as good an understanding of anyone in the country about what are viable transition pathways to net zero that's going to make Canada competitive. I got to tell you, we're really happy with our sponsors. One of the ways I evaluated events is just taking a look at who's sponsoring it. So think of our top level sponsors. This one, for example, is OPG, Ontario Power. We have Power Sustainable, which is one of Canada's largest private equity firms. They've said very clearly they're going to this event because they think it's going to give them a competitive advantage in their business. We've got Canada's largest electricity industry association, Electricity Canada. We've got the Chemical Association. We've got EDC, BDC. We've got the City of Hamilton. Really begs the question where the City of Toronto is. The event's in Toronto. They're not sponsoring Toronto. Maybe you should step up. That's our Net Zero Forum. It's filling up pretty quick. So I'd encourage people that are interested in that to go to the Transition Accelerator website, get more info, and we're happy to talk to anyone that wants to get more details on that. All right. Next thing on our housekeeping is our courses. So we have a series of courses that we've delivered to about 800 people over the last 2 years, ranging from listed companies to governments at every level. Large numbers of people from various parts of the finance sector find these things useful. One of the ones is called Net Zero Changes Everything, a strategic approach. So if you're interested on this, again, more details on our website, or we have people you can actually talk to. I'm just going to say that many organizations bring a whole group, and of course there's group discounts for all these courses. Another is modeling for non-modelers. I mean, when you actually take the proverbial step aside, we are retooling the global economy in this transition. We're fundamentally retooling how the global economy works. And almost always the decisions that we're making on how we're retooling the economy is based on modeling. So this course is designed to demystify modeling and modeling outputs. So if you're a non-modeler, you can ask the right questions of the modelers to make sure that you really, really understand that what they've done in their modeling and the implications for you and your business or your company. We've got a brand new course. We've just tested it out and there's about 95% satisfaction rate from participants. This is advancing clean fuels in heavy trucking. Really interested and excited to have this one coming online in the next while. Okay, now we're shifting gears to webinars. So we have a webinar series. Our objective is to bring the most important global topics with an international flavor, with a little bit of entertainment in this series. The next webinar is on April 22nd, and we're asking the question, what if we get the transition right? A little bit of a different perspective, maybe more of a positive spin, upside versus downside. And lastly, we have the Building Decarbonization Alliance Forum coming up April 17 and 18 in Ottawa. Again, very excited about this as well. When you take a look at the sponsors, these are the top tier institutions in this country that are interested in this issue. So think Canadian infrastructure banks. We've got sponsorship from big five banks. Industry is extremely interested in this. We've got about 170 members in this alliance. So again, go to the Building Decarbonization Alliance website for more information. And there are actually people that will talk to you to understand whether this is a good use of your time. We sure think it is. Okay, now let's get to the topic of the day here. So again, just to refresh people's memory, the topic is, does a natural gas ban fit into Canada's net zero future? We're really happy to have some international personalities here, really some of the best people in the world that have been struggling with this issue over the past number of years. So we have Paul Cheliak, who is the Vice President from the Canadian Gas Association. I'm going to turn to each of the people to talk a little bit more about themselves and what they do. Then we have Matt Poirier, who's the Director of Policy at the Building Decarbonization Alliance. I'm just going to flag, in the pre-read material we have on the website for this webinar, there was a document, there was a jurisdictional scan, basically the most up-to-date document analysis that we know of in the world around what jurisdictions on the planet are banning natural gas and which ones are actually banning the ban of natural gas. So Matt's going to talk a little bit about that in his intro. Very happy to have Russell Unger, who is the principal of carbon-free buildings at the Rocky Mountain Institute, one of the American preeminent organizations that deals with analysis and leading policy advice. And then Monica Vidal from the Heating Campaign Coordinator, that's what she is, from the Climate Action Network in Europe. She's coming to us from France. It's about 6:00 p.m. her time. Thank you very much for ramming us into your schedule. Monica has been one of the leading personalities on this issue for the continent of Europe for a long time. So that's my super quick intro. Now I'm going to turn to each of our guests in sequence for a little bit more detail. Sort of 2 minutes, also sort of an opening statement too about what their organization's position is on this issue of the potential for natural gas bans. And I'm going to turn to Matt first.
Great, thanks, Dan. So yeah, hi everyone. My name is Matt Poirier. Like Dan said, I'm Director of Policy here at the Building Decarbonization Alliance. So we are a coalition working with over 180 partners now to really inspire and accelerate market transformation in the building sector. So we think electrification as a pathway is going to be a key means to getting to net zero and to meeting Canada's climate goals, and we're helping support that transition again with our partners. I'm joining from Toronto today, so a few of us are participating at the CMPX show this week. So if you are in town and planning on attending that, it'd be great to see you. Please swing by our booth. And in terms of just kind of a quick intro on, how does a natural gas make sense for getting building emissions to net zero? Yeah, our position is really, natural gas bans are a very effective tool at driving emission elimination, which is what we need at this point, right? The paradigm has shifted from a reduction paradigm to an elimination paradigm. We need to get to zero by 2050, and these types of policies can be helpful in doing so, but we do need the right context to be able to put them in place. So across the country currently, if you do take a look at kind of our jurisdictional scan, we have summarized different provinces and municipal governments that are starting to lead the push on these types of offers. For the most part, there's been a bigger push on the heating oil side of things, so transitioning away from heating oil to electrification, and in part because the business case for that at the building level makes a lot of financial sense, with essentially savings as of day one from that switch on the operational side of things, and there's a bigger impact on emissions as well. But natural gas is starting to come into play more and more with BC's zero carbon step code, and then several municipalities adopting that. Vancouver's been leading the way on requiring um, not-emitting heating sources for their new construction buildings. There's discussion of a similar policy in Montreal around, again, new construction being moved away or towards electrification at the end of the day, or non-emitting sources. So there's a few different opportunities there. And so new construction seems like a good place to start putting these policies in place. With existing buildings, really need to ensure that we have a few items kind of lined up before we go with a ban. You know, you need to have industry support for these types of initiatives to ensure that the transition can happen smoothly. There needs to be political capital or buy-in to be able to put such a policy in place and provide the market with the certainty it requires to be able to act on that and shift how they're doing business today to allow for that decarbonized future. And you also just need to have a complementary suite of other initiatives or policies to really help get the market to where you need to be able to support a ban. So whether that's incentives for of the vulnerable community, whether it's capacity building programs for industry or other policies, which we'll touch on today. Yeah, there needs to be a few other pieces in place. So I think I've gone over my 2 minutes. Maybe I'll take a pause there. And
Yeah, well, that's great, Matt. Excellent. So now we'll go to our two international guests. So maybe, Monica, we can start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you all thank you for having me today. So as Dan said, my name is Monica Vidal. I'm the Heating Campaign Coordinator for Climate Action Network Europe. And maybe a few words about Climate Action Network Europe. We are a network of NGOs, environmental NGOs and development organizations working across Europe, and we are present in 40 countries. We are more than 200 organizations, and our main point is to fight dangerous climate change. And we are doing this through advocacy work, lobby campaigns, specifically focused on the Commission, European Commission, the European Parliament, and of course the Council of the European Union. And yeah, my role is to work on building a heating decarbonization and running some campaigns around this subject. And yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit later about this. But as Dan said before, I'm based in France, so maybe a little bit of context that is interesting for the webinar today is that, for example, in France, the most, I think we are still relying a lot on gas, on fossil gas for heating our homes. I think it's almost half, 50% of the rate of the person they're heating their home with gas. It's not the same situation around in other countries in Europe. For example, in Central and Eastern Europe, they are relying more on coal, even in wood, but that's the case of France. And yeah, and the same for Spain. And also about your question about the ban on the fossil gas. Well, for us at Can Europe, we are very clear that we need to heat our homes without heating the planet. So we need to transition away from fossil fuels when we are talking about heating our homes, and we need to do it as soon as possible. People can no longer afford to rely on all an efficient heating system. So a ban makes sense, but also we need to include this in a more holistic approach. We need to improve the energy performance of our buildings, and we need to start by the worst performing buildings. We need to reduce the demand of these buildings for heating, but also for cooling. And we need to favorize that this transition is affordable and accessible for all. Thank you.
All right, great. Paul, are you there?
Dan, how are you?
Well, thanks. Welcome.
Good. thanks for putting this together, Dan. I guess I'm in some parts the one counter to the other three, although I haven't heard the final commentator speak yet. But look, I really do think these are important. I do my job and I think a certain way with my members. Other people do their job, they think a certain way with their members. And if we don't have a debate about these things and I learn something and hopefully others learn something, then frankly, the end consumer, who we're all trying to help here, will be worse off. So thanks to you, Dan, for you and your team pulling this together. I hope it's fun. Hope we make it a little spicy. But I'm Paul Chiliak, Vice President, Strategy and Delivery with the Canadian Gas Association, based here in Ottawa. Members that I service deliver about 40% of all of the energy needs in Canada. And we span 8 provinces from BC to Nova Scotia. So bans, look, they're highly political, and they have been highly political, and they will continue to be highly political. I think the moment you talk about choice and removing any kind of choice, you're going to spark an emotional reaction. So fundamentally, we think a ban is the wrong way to go about this. The reasons we think it's wrong: peak demand in Canada, depends where you are in the country. BC, peak demand for gas is about 2x the electric system. In Alberta, it's about 9x the electric system. Saskatchewan, it's 6x the electric system. Ontario, our largest province, for example, it's 2.5 times X the electric system. And so when you think about the scale of energy that's delivered through the underground infrastructure, through pipelines, replacing that in any meaningful time frame is just, it's a jaw-dropping exercise with numbers that are just really, really large in terms of the cost of doing it. The second is, this is more of a recent phenomenon, but it's starting to get airtime in Canada, perhaps not as much as it deserves, and that is our power supply. So looking at our major renewable energy power producing provinces, what was once a long supply market for decades is quickly becoming a short supply market in months or years. So I think we need to look really carefully at electrification pathways and figure out, where's the power going to go, right? It can't service everything. And I'll come back to choice. We've done public opinion research. I'm sure all of you have too. And 70% of Canadians say they want choice. And so if you went to the grocery store and there's one kind of apple, you'd probably wonder why there's one kind of apple. Inherently, we want choice in what we do in life, and that includes energy. And the last is resiliency. Multiple systems supporting the end use energy needs of consumers is always going to be preferred and better than just a single system. And interestingly, the 2 provinces most bullish on electrification, British Columbia and Quebec, have both started to look very deeply at hybrid heating, leveraging the gas system and the electric system to do the job that they do best. So I'll park it there for now, Dan, and happy to get into the conversation more. Thanks.
Yeah, that's good. Well done, Paul. Appreciate it. And Russell, we'll turn to you. And I will flag that we've got the figure from the jurisdictional analysis on bans ready to go if we could speak to that as well. But over to you, Russell.
Thanks very much, Dan, for having me today. And Paul, definitely appreciate you joining and adding spice here. I'm, as Dan mentioned, I'm a principal at RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute. We're a global nonprofit. Our mission is to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero carbon future for all. And I lead our strategy for US single family homes. There's about 85 million of them, and they're about 60% of building emissions in the United States. So we can only achieve our climate goals if we stop burning fossil fuels, and that includes burning them at homes. And in the United States today, there's no significant difference in the cost to build an all-electric zero-emission home than a mixed-fuel home. And if anything, all-electric homes cost less to build. And in these new well-insulated homes, utility bills are also lower. And that's without a carbon tax like there is in Canada. And we've looked at this issue in more than 15 US states, including the most northern US states that share climate zones with Canada's like largest cities. That homeowner is going to face less volatility in their energy bills because the price of electricity is more stable than the price of fossil fuels. And in the US, in a single year, gas prices in the last decade have fluctuated more than 100%. That home will also have healthier air, it'll be more comfortable. And so that's why we should be doing that for all new homes. Now, the reason this makes sense as a regulation is the building industry is slow to change. That's why building codes aren't static and they're upgraded on a regular cycle. And it's why 3 US states and over 100 US cities have codes to require or prefer all electric new construction. Now, I think it's really important. Paul mentioned a bunch of issues I'd love to get into when we're talking here about
That's the point.
yeah. So this is a tiny fraction of the homes that are out there. And in every state in the US, or almost every state in the US, and I imagine the case in Canada, the winter peak load for electricity is much lower than the summer peak. We have lots of room. Looking at like Minnesota as an example, a nice northern state, you could, before you'd reach the same summer peak and winter, 23% of homes could have a standard heat pump. 40% could have a high efficiency heat pump. So the peak load isn't really an issue for new construction. And then on the question of choice, this isn't picking a doctor or like a vacation spot. Like most homeowners don't care how their home is heated. They just care that it's warm. So those are just a couple quick responses. Love to dig more into this. And those are my thoughts. If we're doing south of the border, why can't we do it north of the border?
Fair enough. Okay, thanks all. Look, as I was preparing for this and I reread the jurisdictional scan by the Building Decarbonization Alliance, I was really struck by the state of this issue around the world. So what I'd like to do is pull up those two figures, one, the American one again, and then Russell, if you could just speak to it very quickly, sort of what it shows, and then same with Monica. I mean, if I sort of lead off here, basically what this shows is on each of the coasts, you've got whole states that are bringing in rules to restrict natural gas usage in new commercial buildings. And then an awful lot of the middle of the country is doing the opposite. States are bringing in legislation to make sure that lower levels of government can't pass natural gas bans in some way, shape, or form. So a little bit of commentary on that. Russell, any thoughts come to mind?
Sure. First, I'll mention there's a lot of dots that are missing. So I mentioned there's over 100 US cities that also have like policies favoring all electric new construction. So you see a lot more of that in the middle of the country. But yeah, this is a real dynamic. I'd say broadly, a lot of states that produce gas have bans on bans, but most of their key customers, the places where most gas is used, is going the other direction, saying, we don't want this product anymore. It's not like healthy, it's not consistent with our climate goals. So that's our climate goals. So that's the dynamic that's going on in the States.
Yeah, okay, look, great. And look, at all of that more detailed information on individual municipalities or jurisdictions is lower, contained in this document, just not the summary of figures. But could we go to the European one? And Monica, what this again is, sort of half of the equation that's happening in the States. And it does sure seem like countries are on the side of banning oil or gas in new, or in some cases all buildings. So any thoughts from you, Monica, about this?
Yeah, well, you're putting the map there, and the truth is in Europe we have different kind of heating restriction, let's say, for fossil fuels with different situations, and we have in 10 countries you can find like heating restriction for fossil fuels in Europe, like for example in France, in UK, in Norway, in Austria, as you see there. For example, in the case of France, there is a ban on oil boilers for new and existing buildings. So that's mean if you need to replace your oil boiler now, you need to change to other system. But also there is a ban for gas boilers in new buildings. I think that's the situation, how we are where we have restriction for in new buildings or existing buildings. Of course, in the existing buildings is the difficult one, and that's what we are trying also at EU level. For example, in Can-Euro, we are trying to have something more harmonized for the EU level, and in order to have a complete phase out of fossil fuel boilers, and that's what we were trying within the European in the Energy Performance Buildings Directive, and now it's a process that is just finalized. We are in the very final steps of this revision, and what we have in the text so far is that member states, so every country of the EU needs to implement a phase out of fossil fuel boilers by 2040. So now it will depend on every member state how they implement this phase out, let's say.
You know, one of the things I think we could play with here a little bit, and I would say, like, let's make this fluid. Like, anyone jump in at any time here. Don't wait for me to ask a question or anything. But, you know, one of the objectives of this webinar is to understand what is happening in the rest of the world and how applicable is what is happening and the lessons learned is to Canada. And, you know, Monica, what you just said here was, you know, the reason these countries are coming in with bans is because the whole continent has decided to phase out fossil fuels for heating at the level of the EU, right? And that's a huge difference. I mean, we just don't have that level of government here. So, I don't, you know, any thoughts about whether or not these individual countries would have been this aggressive on this if it would without the EU position?
Well, it's tricky because, yeah, for example, what I mentioned now with this complete phase out, this is happening now. This is now in the final revision of the Energy Performance Building Directive. But
Yep.
there are other countries that they advanced with this banning situation for gas and oil. And yeah, I think it's difficult to say what Canada can learn from the experience of Europe from my perspective. But of course, the situation with the war in Ukraine, I think that changed a little bit the narrative and influenced that a lot of countries, they want to favorize and and speed up this transition from fossil fuels to reduce the dependence on gas.
Hey, Dan, I'll just jump in.
Please.
The relative newness of this concept is something to observe. So the gas ban conversation, it's less than 10 years old, and in many jurisdictions has not taken effect in a real way yet. There's dates in the future. So, you know, a lot of this is we don't know what the market's going to do. We don't know what the consumer is going to do when they find out they can't have something they used to have. We have some inclinations of what people might do. If you noticed, in Berkeley was the first city in the United States to put a ban on gas. It was also the first city in the United States to have that overturned by the Ninth Circuit Court. So I think a lot of this happens in municipal council rooms, which the average person is not tuning into to follow. And they don't find out until they find out, right? And depends where you are. But when people do find out, they say, hold on, why is that? Why can I not have something that I used to have? So one is the market reaction to this from a behavioral perspective. The other is, what does it do to the broader energy market? And so, you know, to Russell's point earlier, in some jurisdictions, and that's an interesting point, that the summer peak may be able to handle some of this winter peak. But en masse, is anyone looking at this from a systems perspective with the EVs, with heat pumps, with talks of electrical or industrial electrification? Are the building people within municipalities looking at this from a systems perspective, or is everyone just chasing the same electrons? And so I think the market response from a behavioral perspective is still to be seen, but also from a systems perspective on what it does to our grids is also still to be seen.
Look, that's a question. You know, Russell, I'm going to go to you in a second. I'm going to give a very crass answer here. Like, is anyone looking at this from a systems perspective? I'm just going to say, yeah, the Transition Accelerator is. And if you want to learn more, come to our forum in May in Toronto, May 14th, 15th. Done. Russell, over to you. Yeah.
Sure. And I, first of all, I agree. I agree with Paul that like we've got to plan for a larger energy grid in the future. There's no question about that. We want to get off fossil fuels to address climate change, and the way to do that is switch to electricity, and that's going to require a larger grid. And we need to do that plan. We need to do it smart. We need to do load management because we got to control the costs. But again, I'll just say that what we're talking about here, no gas for new residential construction, that is a tiny, tiny amount of electricity to add on the grid. That will make no meaningful impact to any planning scenario. So it's an important part of the overall conversation with a transition to electricity, but it's not something that to drive the debate today. I also would just say that, as I mentioned before, I don't believe consumers, I've never seen anything, consumers care how their home is heated. There are a lot of jurisdictions now that do have these requirements in place. And I also have not heard of any kind of consumer backlash. I've heard of there's a lot of industry backlash against that, i.e. like the fossil fuel industry, but most homeowners, again, they want to be able to cook their food, they want hot water, they want heating, and as long as it works well, that's good for them. So I think that it's the sort of thing that happens in basements, and homeowners are happy when their homes work well, and they certainly work well when they're all electric.
I'm going to invoke a moderator technique here called the pregnant pause, and I'm going to wait until someone else talks before I do.
Yeah, I think
Oh, that was quick.
just to add to that, you know, to Paul's point that these are relatively new policies. You know, some of them have been in place for a couple of years now, but I think even for the ones that are coming into place, like municipalities who are for the most part leading on this, aren't going in blind, right? They are doing consultations. It's not like they're voting on a gas ban for new construction and just hoping for the best. There are processes in place where they're getting input from the industry, you know, reaching out to citizens, just to try to understand some of the implications of this moving forward. So it's not, yeah, it's not, there are processes to get this to work.
Yeah, I would challenge that, Matthew. I actually don't think they're getting good advice, and I don't think they're talking to their constituents. And I don't think municipalities are equipped to do the analysis properly. Here's the reality. I think you probably know this. There's about 3 consultants in this country that do every one of the climate plans for every municipality. I won't name them, but I'm sure you know who they are. Maybe you're a new entrant into that space. It's the same model. We all know who runs the model that gives the same results every single time. And so when you hire someone to do this analysis on a piece of paper, you're going to get a certain result because you've told them what you want the outcome to be. So I question whether the rigor has been put into it. Step 1. Step 2 is they look at their municipality, Burnaby, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, you name it. What does that mean for the rest of the province, which has the grid that then feeds you? And so what you've seen in Quebec is the province step in and say, municipalities aren't allowed to develop their own energy scenarios now without first checking with the province to ensure that there is grid capacity to serve that municipality. So in the hydro-rich province of Quebec, they've said no to this. So I think there's, again, it comes back to this systems perspective. I think municipalities should look at this. Like, it does make sense. They have targets, they have commitments, but to suggest that they've talked to their people, I think would be a bit rich.
Look, I'm actually going to come in here and I'm going to agree with Paul on an awful lot of what he said, but I'll put a slightly different perspective on it. I keep coming back to this idea that when you really, really think about it, take the proverbial step aside, we're fundamentally retooling the whole global economy. We're fundamentally retooling Canada's economy. When I take a look at the modeling horsepower that exists to advise the UNFCCC, right? This is the IPCC. I mean, there's thousands of people using dozens and dozens and dozens of models. Like, I mean, there's a really high degree of certainty. When I take a look at Canada, we've got a handful. We just do. And I don't think I'm alone and Paul and I are alone in that opinion. In fact, I know the government of Canada feels very strongly that we need to have much more modeling capacity. And it's why NRCan has come up with a program to support new modelers, to develop new models and new ways of thinking on this. This is not, backtracking or greenwashing. It's just a fact that we do not have the implications of the decisions that we're taking based on what information, I think, is really skinny. And that's one of the reasons, frankly, why we launched the Transition Accelerator. And one of the reasons why we launched the Building Decarbonization Alliance is that, this is not greenwashing. We need more modelers and modeling capacity. Matt, can I put you on the spot to talk a little bit about your open source model?
Yeah, for sure, Dan. So we are developing an open source building decarbonization model, essentially to take a look at that at the national and provincial scale, to look at questions like what would happen if you were to implement a natural gas ban? What would happen if you were to require, any new construction to be decarbonized in the future? So we have a number of different archetypes that work in different climate zones across the country, taking a look at some of those questions. We're still just in the final phases of kind of refining this first phase of our analysis, and our next steps are really to bring that out to the industry to validate some of the assumptions that we had to make, as we do with all models, and to really ground truth what those outputs and inputs ultimately are, before we can have the confidence to really go out with the results from that and show what some of the impacts are going to be on energy requirements, on peak demand for the electrical grid, on the need for natural gas, and how we can how that need may change over time going out to 2050 to decarbonize world. So yeah, stay tuned for a bit more information. Everything's open source in the model, so everything is in the process of being uploaded and public. Our assumptions, the code itself, but yeah, we'll continue to share as we work on that.
Look, I'm just going to flag, even that model is not going to be the be all end all, but it is another platform transparently with another group thinking about these important questions, and that we just need more of that. So look, this is sort of techie, eggheady kind of stuff, but we're into that here at the accelerator. Monica and Russell, has that idea of the need for more technical analysis by more people, is that a dynamic in your jurisdiction? Has that ever come up?
Yeah, I can start if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, first of all, maybe to do the transition before answering your specific question, I think we can. I want to talk. We've been talking about models, and of course we need data, but I think we need to speak also about people. That is the people that really use this heating system to warm their homes, and I wanted to also to mention that maybe to give you the example of Spain, from where I am, and what I'm seeing there is in the new buildings, and the people can choose the heating system that they can use. People are choosing a heat pump. Why? Because this is the same technology that they can use for cooling. And as I said before, we need to really take into account the context of the country. And in these countries, for example, the cooling needs are now even more important than the heating ones. And the heat pump is the solution in this case for heating and cooling. And the people with resources, they choose the heat pumps. But what happened? That the vulnerable people, they are not buying new houses. So they are still living in the very worst performing buildings, and they are locking on fossil fuel boilers. And that's why at Can Europe, within the Energy Performance Building Directive, we are really highlighting that we need to renovate more buildings. In this renovation, we include the integration of renewable heating solutions at heat pumps, but we need to start also for the worst performing buildings, because in these buildings are also the people that are more vulnerable. And that I wanted to say that but because we need to speak with the people that are using this technology also. But coming back to your question about the data, of course, is what we need to do public policy. We need to rely on data, on science-based information. That should be if not, how we're gonna do that? Of course, we need this information. We need this data. And for example, that's also important in relation with energy poverty. In Europe, we have an important lack of data on energy poverty. Who is these people? In which kind of buildings they live? Because it's not the same living in a multi-apartment building than in a single family home. So it's not the same process to decarbonize these buildings neither. So we need data. And of course, I cannot see how we can do it without this information.
Russell, any thoughts on the U.S. dynamic here, if it's worthwhile speaking about?
Yeah, I would say, I think we're all agreed that for our kind of medium and long-term planning, we need analysis that takes into account a lot of stuff. So we need to be looking at both implications from buildings, from transportation, from growth of grid. And we need to do that because we have to balance things against each other. So you can invest more, particularly when we're talking about existing buildings. You can invest more in making buildings more energy efficient, or you can invest more in enlarging the grid, and those kind of play off each other. And we need to kind of find the most kind of cost-effective midpoint. I do want to kind of go back to I want to not lose sight in this conversation that we kicked it off with a discussion about all electric new homes. And we don't need more information to do that, to say that's something that we can require. We have all electric new homes across the world. We have them in Canada, we have them in the US. There's plenty of room on the grid. There's 16 million or so existing housing units in Canada. The total added last year was like in the 260, 270,000 number. So there's nothing to stop us going forward with that. And I think what we do is, while we're getting more and better information, we do the things that make sense, and we do them now. And that includes like stop like making our problem worse, stop like adding fossil fuels to new buildings.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, even to put a little bit of a nuance on my last comments, I mean, again, governments, especially NRCan, understands that the more modeling we have, the better we'll be. They have launched an energy modeling hub out of the Trache Energy Institute. So if people are interested in more about that, it's not as if this issue of, we can do better is not understood. It is, and people are taking pretty significant steps, especially NRCan, in making sure that happens. So, Russell, you've done a good job of sort of bringing me back to like, what the heck are we talking about here? So let's go back to the ban. And maybe I'm going to ask an open-ended question and have people pipe in, rant. If we don't do bans, what are other alternatives? I'm going to use the pregnant pause technique. And especially, have our international colleagues, have you waded through this question in your jurisdictions?
Well, I guess I'll start with, go ahead. Who's gonna?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Dan, don't have the international perspective necessarily, but I guess I come back to answer that question partly with what Russell said was, if these homes are being built, and there's 200 and some thousand that was referenced, if people don't care about the energy they actually use in their home, then why do you need to ban something? If we're ready for electrification, if the market's apparently ready, if the technology is ready, if the consumer doesn't mind, why do you need the ban? Right?
Yeah, maybe I can.
You want me to respond to that one?
Yeah.
Matt, why don't you go ahead first? Yeah.
I think in some regions in Canada, it's a bit of a stacked deck against electrification for new construction at the moment. So when we're talking about expansion of the natural gas grid to new construction, a lot of those costs are embedded into the rate case, where they may not necessarily be so on the electricity side of things. So the OEB decision that came out in December, I kind of alluded to this as well, but essentially,
Just for the sake of all of our folks here, OEB.
The Ontario Energy Board, in Ontario. So,
and what's their role in this?
They essentially Enbridge and kind of the electric utilities in Ontario will propose they'll provide rate cases and propose what their ongoing initiatives are going to look like, or their ongoing operations, and the OEB is there to make sure that essentially those are aligned with the objectives. The objectives.
So they're a regulator.
Regulator. Yeah, at the end of the day. So
yeah.
trying to make sure that consumers are best off with the decisions that the utilities are making at the end of the day. And so there was a bit of pushback on being able to rate base new expansion costs over the historical lifetime that's been used for the equipment, just with the energy transition coming into play. And so taking on more of those costs upfront, in discussions with some of our partners who are focused on electrification, would even the playing field and even shift it a bit more towards the electrification side of things. So I think, policies like this one are helpful in kind of swinging that pendulum back, just to ensure that people do have a choice at the end of the day, that developers aren't necessarily swayed due to lower costs for going about installing natural gas in their new homes. Yeah.
Russell?
I'll start with kind of the, why do we need to ban here? Well, the first is that the demand's not going to come from a typical consumer who, as I said, doesn't really care how their home is heated, how their hot water gets hot. So you're not going to have a strong demand signal. And then industry is slow to change. Like industry has to have a motivation to do something differently when what they know and they know it works. And so it's not going to come from industry on its own. So that's where regulations come in, and especially in a situation where there isn't a negative cost impact, it's like an excellent place for regulation. To your question, Dan, about what do you do when you can't have regulation? So you put the map on the United States. There's lots of the US where the prospects of climate policy are pretty low. So incentives can play a big role. That's usually how you're usually going to get early adopters there, but that's how things begin. Your neighbor puts something in, you hear about it, it looks good to you. That contractor who's trying something for the first time, it's going to be a little easier for them to do it for the second customer. There's consumer education, and then I think there's just like media. The point about the health issues with all electric buildings are really significant. You're 42% more likely as a child to be diagnosed with asthma symptoms if you grow up in a home with gas stoves, the one without. So these are real, and these are beginning to affect what people want.
I would put a point of order to this, Dan, just on the record, that the comment about indoor air quality and asthma in children is, I would not say settled. I think there are as many reports that dispute that as there are that showcase it. So we come back to Health Canada regulations, which, well, they're not regulations or guidelines, indoor air quality guidelines. So I think if you talk to the federal health regulators, they may take exception with that kind of statement. So I would want us to just, for the record, note that there are conflicting studies on that point.
Look, Paul, that's very, very fair. And, at the Accelerator, we're basically want to be ruthlessly driven by analysis data. The difficulty is, of course, getting consensus on how much certainty there is before you act. But your point on this notion of that being an unsettled piece is taken.
Maybe so I had the floor, Dan.
Yep.
So what if not bans? I guess that's a really important question, right?
That's sort of the big question that we're talking about here, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, I don't think we've actually tried a lot of things, right? And so we've kind of attempted to do, or are attempting to do in some places, a leapfrog, and I don't think we've shaken the tree hard enough. And so you're starting to see with the hybrid heating discussion to say, look, there are clear and obvious benefits to gas, right? And there are clear and obvious benefits to electricity. How do we make these things work together? How do we incent utilities to work together, to make it work together for the homeowner, right? So that the electric utility isn't forever incented to look after its business interests and the gas utility its. So the concept of integrated resource planning between utilities to actually look at that customer as a single customer, I don't think we've tried that enough. So that's a big one. The other is, I'll just bring up renewable gases. We've all heard of RNG and hydrogen. I think the limitation there in many instances is an economic regulatory question. And this gets wonky, Dan, but I think it's a fundamental point that challenges both gas and electric utilities, which is the utility acts, or the legislation that governs what they can invest in, were written many decades ago. In almost all instances, they don't consider a utility's ability to invest in decarbonization activities on the gas side or the electric side. That is starting to change. But boy, do we really need to update the legislative frameworks which govern what a utility can invest in, both gas and electric. And that is something that en masse, we haven't done yet.
Look, let's play with that. I got to tell you, I sort of find it unfathomable that is still an issue. It is an issue, Paul. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, utilities are highly regulated in Canada. They're not allowed to do whatever they want. They're literally, the regulator dictates what technologies they are allowed to invest in. We've been talking about climate change very formally since the UNFCCC was signed in 1992. That was a UN treaty after years and years of science, years and years of negotiation. So, this is really a 40-year discussion. And here we are 40 years later, and it's still an issue that utilities cannot invest in decarbonization in some parts of Canada. So, let's play with that. What does that mean for us? Can we wait for the regulatory to change? What are options to change the regulatory system quicker? Has this been an issue in the States and Europe? How have you addressed it? Just sort of throw the floor open here.
If I may,
Monica, what happened? Yeah, great.
yeah, because before going this, because before I mentioned that in Europe we have in 10 countries we have kind of hitting restriction so far, but what we have also is in 15 countries we can still have subsidies for fossil to support fossil fuels boilers. That means that the public money is put in to favorize the replacement of an oil gas boilers for a new gas boilers. And this is something that we need to stop as well, because if not, the transition away from fossil fuel boilers will be very difficult. So if we want to play in a fair play situation, we need to eliminate these subsidies also for fossil fuel boilers. And in relation with this, in the hybrid system that Paul mentioned, in Europe we saw in the revision of the Energy Performance Directive, where we are including the stop of these subsidies for fossil fuel boilers in 2025. We managed to have this, but the text nowadays includes so much flexibility to that finally we know that we can still subsidize in hybrid systems. So finally we're going to have this people looking in fossil fuels for years and years. So we need to stop these subsidies, but really for good. And I think that's also the way. And we need a ban for fossil fuel boilers, because we need to stop burning stuff on our homes to heat our homes, and we need to stop climate change, and that's the way. And we need also to incentivize renewables heating solution, but of course we need to reduce the demand of our homes. So we need a completely holistic approach. We need to reduce our demands. We need renewables in our heating, in our grids, and so, yeah, we need a renewable heating system in our homes.
Thanks. Anyone else on this one? The role of the regulatory system.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of efforts that have been happening in the States about engaging utilities, changing how utilities are regulated, how they're compensated. And some of these are conversations are easier if you have a mixed utility providing both electricity and gas. So as many folks know, that utility makes money when they build things generally. So if you have a utility that has both a gas infrastructure and electric infrastructure, if they're building out the electric infrastructure, that's okay, because they're going to make their money there, even if they're kind of winding down the gas. So, there's a lot of effort, there's regulatory proceedings called Future of Gas that are trying to look at what this would look like long term. There is pilots being done on let's try network geothermal. So providing geothermal heat through pipes. Or hot waters can also be converted for cooling in strange ways. There are regulations called clean heat standards, where they say, okay, we're not going to say exactly how you get there, but let's have a reduction in the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuels being provided for heat. So if RNG somehow does things that surprise folks, and that can be a bigger part of the mix, then it becomes part of the mix. Those are some things that are happening. We could spend a bunch of time talking about renewable natural gas. Happy to go there if you want to go there for a bit.
Just a bit more on the regulatory stuff, just because it really is an issue that is often not well understood. I'm glad to hear, Russell, that you do understand this, because it's so central. I mean, what you're starting to see, and it's early, is economic regulators being either directed or slowly chipping away at the inclusion of, I'll call it, environmental metrics within the economic regulatory framework. And I don't know where that all goes. It's too early to tell. But the question is, how do you retool a regulator who, for its entire existence, has really been focused on economic regulation, just the straight cost to the consumer and the rates that ensue, to one that now has to formally examine either emission reduction targets, climate policy more generally. So you're not downloading a provincial or federal government's obligation into an economic regulator, but you kind of are. And so the regulators, from what I've heard, said, are we equipped to do this? So what do we need within our own staff to actually look at a filing from a utility and make an accurate determination? It's the last place that exists where you're cross-examined on your energy statements, your energy cost, and your energy assumptions. That doesn't exist in the policy world. It doesn't exist in the ENGO world, doesn't exist even in my world. You really do need that hearing room as that crown jewel to test people's resolve and assumptions. And so this is a space to watch. I don't think it's fully settled yet, but absolutely critical that economic regulation evolve, but in a way that doesn't download the policy goals onto the regulator.
This is the pregnant pause again. Any other thoughts on basically the role of the regulator? And what we sort of trickled into here is, are the regulators equipped to change quickly enough to be up to the challenge of building decarbonization? I can tell you, I mean, we work with regulators, we work with utilities right across the country. And like, we know from our personal interactions that there are many utilities that would like to change much, much quicker. It's illegal for them to change quicker. It's as simple as that. I mean, that's inflammatory language, but the reality is that the things that they want to do they're not allowed to do. Any other thoughts on that? I'm not going to beat this horse too much longer, but
I guess I'm thinking back
Just
to
one more thing, Dan, 'cause again, yeah, you first, Russell.
Sure. Just so you know, it's brought up a couple times, but in like most jurisdictions, there's a subsidy when you want to install gas. So the line that comes out from the street is paid for by other ratepayers. And conversely, if you want to disconnect that line, a homeowner then has to pay to do that. That's actually my personal circumstance I had with my house renovation in Toronto. So Monica brought this up, but there's like the kind of low-hanging fruit here is, let's like start removing the things that are subsidizing the more kind of carbon intensive approach, and that often does require changes to legislation. Not always, depends on the jurisdiction.
yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue if we're going to remove the amortization period that connects the gas line, then we should remove it for electricity too and let the market decide. But that's a separate issue. On the point earlier about electricity and regulators, you know, the folks I do talk to on the electric utility side of things, they say, look, it's really difficult here too. There's a policy aspiration to do a lot more on the electric side. There's an economic regulator who's looking very carefully at costs. And so walking in with very bold plans with bold budget increases, which then have ratepayer increases, is not an easy thing to do at any time. And so I think the economic regulator and some electric utilities are starting to figure out, how do we do this? How do we pass these costs on? Because they're not insignificant.
Okay, fair enough. Paul, maybe can I ask you to speak a little bit about, look, you know, full transparency, as you might expect, Paul and I had a conversation yesterday to prepare for this. And can you speak a little bit about, and this is touchy for an industry association, I get that, but sort of the degree of motivation among your members in terms of decarbonization? So let's just park the concept of a ban, but this notion of decarbonization.
I'd say there's not a single company that doesn't have a team of people looking at it, right? And so that is a shift from even a couple of years ago. Some titles have changed to have the word transition in them, or things of that nature, Dan. So you're definitely seeing that. I can also say that more than 10 years ago, 2 utilities in Ontario, there was 2 at the time, there's just 1 now, applied to the regulator for a renewable natural gas program and were told no. So, you know, it's not as if we haven't been looking at this stuff for a very, very long time. It's just a matter of, how do you get an economic regulator to really think about it? Demand side management went through the same thing 25 years ago. Why would a utility, like gas or electric, want a customer to use less? They're just going to make less money. So you have to put an incentive there for them to make the customer use less by offering programs. And so I think that's part of the structure over the long term. Like, what's the incentive for a utility to do their business differently, gas or electric? And until you have an incentive to do it differently, no rational business is going to. I mean, that's just how business works. So that's another point. I'd say lastly is, look, the industry has been around for 150 years, right? It has embedded cultures, embedded way of doing things. It's not dissimilar to government institutions or others. And it's a big ship to turn around, right? And so I think there's an element of patience, there's an element of skill set, and that's just still going to take some time.
I mean, of course, the argument against that is we don't have the time, right? And that's really at the core of all this, is bumping up against institutional momentum, capacity, culture versus the urgency. So that's, Monica, I'd like to play a little bit about with this idea of sort of consumer pushback, or the need to have sort of a consumer support. What was the European experience in that? We get, I would say, probably quite a filtered view of news coming out of Europe, and we hear of, yellow vests and, agricultural protests and so on. How has the ban gone in Europe at the level of the consumer?
Well, that's a very good point, Dan. And if I made before, when I started, I mentioned that I'm a campaigner. I'm the heating campaigner at Can Europe, and nowadays I'm running 2 campaigns. I start with one, is the One Home for All, with the idea to favorize the deployment of renewable heating solution. But since last year, in 2023, I start a new one, Build Better Lives campaign. And we saw this as a reaction campaign because all the backlash and and also the increase of the right far in Europe, in many countries, the revision of the energy performance building directive received a lot of reaction from specific countries, and that's why we initiate this campaign, to counterbalance the narrative about this in favor of a positive narrative, that this directive really can't improve the life of people, because the arguments were like against of this. So that's the situation in Europe. The far right is very present in many countries, and they are using and they are inflammating some arguments about how the Europe want to impose us these different environmental legislation and on renewables, but also on agriculture, etc. So how we live this as an organization fighting against climate change, that with surprise and worried because we need to, as I said before, because we need to talk with the people. We need to explain the situation really to the people, and because the messages that we receive are very contradictory, and they are using a lot of this from different political parties, I will say.
Russell,
and also, sorry to interrupt you, but this year in June 2024, we're gonna have the European elections, and also this is not looking very promising for environmental policies, let's say.
any thoughts on that from the U.S., Russell?
I guess the thing that comes to mind is, there was a significant shift in the U.S. climate movement, maybe starting about a decade ago, with the People's Climate March in New York after Superstorm Sandy. And so a lot more environmental policy in the U.S. is kind of grassroots driven, like local advocates are driving it. And so the answer, again, is back of like, what do people actually want? The voters that are willing to speak up and make their voices heard, reach out to legislators. Those are ones who are motivated on climate. Those are ones who want this change. They've looked at it. So that's the thing that kind of comes to mind to Monica's comments.
All right. Look, I'm just noticing there's about 40 questions in the chat. To be blunt, most of them are sort of asking questions for Paul to speak to, like, what's the sector's plans to decarbonize, or, you know, to stop selling gas. I mean, Paul, maybe I will look for some commentary from you. I mean, that's a wicked problem. When you're a gas company, right, is it actually reasonable to ask the company for ways to put itself out of business? You know, it's very difficult for a gas company to switch to be an electricity company. It just doesn't work that way. So for double-breasted companies, utilities that sell electricity and gas, as Paul has already said, and Russell, you know, that's actually a relatively easy thing. You can just sort of switch your emphasis. But, you know, if you're an oil sands company, is it reasonable to ask that oil sands company to stop producing oil? The answer is they've shown absolutely no indication that they're going to do that. In fact, they keep ramping up production. And like, how reasonable is it to ask a gas company to be part of the wave to stop using gas? It's like asking you know, beef farmers to become vegan. I don't know how useful it is to even ask that question. But Paul, do you have thoughts on this? It's more of a commentary, and I know it's a difficult one. Yeah.
No, I think it's a fair question though, Dan. I mean, it probably comes back to the lens to which you look through the world at, right? And if you look through the lens of net zero exclusively, then you certainly have an answer for that question. If you look at the world through the lens of perhaps resiliency, security, choice, consumer preference, then you get a different answer. And so if we model net zero 2050, what's the role of natural gas in home heating? You're going to get a result. Like, I'm not going to argue that. But is that the only path? And is that what people really want? And I've heard a lot of we statements, and I'm not sure who people are referring to when they say we. I don't think we as a homogeneous, everyone in Canada agrees with everything that's been said around a variety of things. What the gas industry feels, electric industry feels, what the policymaker feels. I think there's still very much different camps, right? So I wouldn't want to suggest there's a we answer to any of this. But for sake of rounding it out, like, we researched it, and I'll put it in the behind the scenes chat, Dan, and you can put it in the main chat. We modeled net zero for every building in Canada to 2050 using the gas infrastructure as the conduit to do that. And we found that we can do it, minus about 10%, which we'd have to buy offsets for. And so again, is the modeling work we did perfect? Probably not. Is it going to cost a lot? Absolutely. But it's feasible and you can do it. And so we've researched this. All the companies have researched this in Canada, and I think they've all found anything is possible with the right amount of capital. So I'd perhaps leave it at that the consumer at the end of the day is the one who we think about most, right? And if there's a better way of doing it, and the market finds that way of doing it, the companies I work for will probably be in that business too, right? Because they've evolved over time and they'll continue to.
Well, haven't we answered that question though? Isn't electrification a better way of doing it, at least for the low-hanging fruit for new builds?
I don't think we have. I mean, you're still seeing near record connections to the natural gas system in Canada. We had a record consumption, a record production in 2023. The US hit records in those two categories, plus became the world's largest exporter of LNG. So I think you have to look truthfully at what the market wants and be comfortable with that. And look, do we have to look at ways of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions that are attributed to consuming natural gas? Of course we do. But at a point, shouldn't the market be able to decide?
But do we? This is an interesting one. It sort of brings a couple of threads together. But I mean, the market truly doesn't really decide. The regulator does, right? And we've sort of been through this discussion to sort of say, there are municipalities that want to ban gas. That's the market. That's the people, and they're being told in many cases that they're not allowed to, as Matt said, I mean, the deck is stacked up against them, amortizing over 40 years and that type of thing, rather than having to, a more reasonable amortization period aligned with climate change. Anyway, maybe I'll leave it at that and see if anyone else has some final thoughts on this. We've got 5 more minutes, and wouldn't mind a final statement, short, from each person. And yeah, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead, Paul? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go last, Dan. How about that?
Yeah, that's fine. Considering we've almost ganged up on you here 3-1, I think that's very, very fair. So, Matt?
Yeah, I can just touch on there's the amortization piece, but there's also other pieces that also stack the deck. So Ontario has a natural gas expansion program, which is essentially every ratepayer is going to pay $1 a month, more or less, to the provincial government, who will then pass it back on for expansion of the natural gas network. So there's a couple of other pieces in there as well that are really supporting natural gas expansion, that new construction piece. So again, leveling that playing field would be really would be a great first step if we're not going all the way to bans. But I'll leave it at that.
Fair. Monica?
Yeah, thank you. Well, again, I think I can finish remembering that we have urgency. We have urgency to address energy poverty, to address energy security, but also the heating challenges that we've been talking before. And we have the solutions. We have renewable heating solutions that are reliable, and they are on our hands. So now it's political will that what we need. But we need also to improve the energy performance of our buildings, because that will reduce our energy heating and cooling demands. That will reduce our bills, and yeah, that will of course reduce, as I said, they will improve also our comfort in our homes, of course. And but at least we also need to plan this transition, and for that we need the local heating and cooling plans, where the local governments, they can be in contact and in dialogue with the social organization working in the ground, and also favorizing the contact with the people that will be at the end people that will use these heating systems.
Okay, I'll go second last then. Just want to begin by a couple commentators corrected me on my assumption that winter and summer peak profiles will be similar for Canadian provinces as US states. So I can't speak firsthand on that. So if I'm incorrect on that, thanks for the correction. I just want to circle back to the organizing question here, which was about building only all electric new construction in Canada. And a lot of what's been discussed today are really important considerations for long-term planning for full electrification. As I said a few times this call, there's nothing to stop us going forward with building all electric, emission-free buildings today. And we should do that. Let's not dig the hole deeper. And then the last thing I would say is Paul, one of the last things you said is, shouldn't we be comfortable with what the market wants? Shouldn't the market get to decide? And the answer to that is absolutely not. I mean, the market should get to decide within parameters that policymakers have set. And the market decisions are why we have climate change today. We've done what was cost effective. And with the policies were in place, it's why I'm collecting maple syrup in early March in Ontario. It's why there's pine bark beetle marching across Canada that never used to be able to get there because winters were colder. It's why there's ticks in Southern Ontario that never used to be here. The climate's changing, and that's because of the market. And now we have to shift the market and make it one that's aligned with decarbonization and all electric, and bend the curve back to addressing climate change.
I would just conclude again by thanking you for pulling this together. I think it was fun. I think we should come back for round 2 and do this again in a year, because I think this issue is certainly again an early one, and it's going to evolve. I'd end with 3 things. One is, think about the infrastructure in a different way. So 100 years ago or more, there was hydrogen and CO2 that flowed through pipelines to light streetlights. Electric light bulb came along, those pipes were going to run empty. We found natural gas, we repurposed the pipes. The pipes now are looking at integrating renewable products into them. Is it fast enough? To be determined. Is it all doable? To be determined. But think of that infrastructure as a conduit for multiple public policy objectives, including emission reductions. Third is, if you really want to cut your teeth in this topic, join as an intervener in a hearing and bring your analysis to that table. and sit before a lawyer who will cross-examine you on your assumptions and findings. I think that's the best way for people to really learn whether what they think and what their assumptions are in fact true. I'll come back to it's one of the last places we have where the real answer is debated, the lawyers get a chance to cross-examine, and ultimately a decision is made. I'll end with that, Dan, but the industry remains poised and ready. Call us anytime. We have a lot to offer, and we look forward to a bright future. Thanks.
Look, folks, the role of the transition accelerator is not really to take hard sides in these kinds of debates and discussions, it's to pull them together. And the reality is that these are complex issues with lots of factors influencing them. I just want to thank all of the participants. I'm not going to say especially Paul coming, he's representing a sector that is undergoing massive change here. I actually learned a lot. I think everyone did. Love the idea of coming back for round two. I'm actually going to flag for participants here, if you have a topic that you think you would like for us to deal with here at the Transition Accelerator on one of these webinars, send us an email, info@transitionaccelerator.ca, info@transitionaccelerator.ca. We want these sessions to be as useful as possible for people. Bring a range of opinions on tough topics. So love to hear from you. I'm also going to say I think I did sort of a crappy moderating job. Didn't get to the audience questions quick enough simply because I was too interested in what the panelists were saying. But I'll do a better job next time. Thanks all. Really appreciate this, and I'm looking forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you, Dan.
See you all.
Panelists.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, all.